Okay, so welcome back to the immune system. This is topic 13-2, and this is part B. Yes, part B. It's a two-part lecture. I wanted to keep all of my videos short and digestible. So where did we leave off? We were talking about the humoral response. The humoral response involves the B cells secreting antibodies. We also talked about the cell-mediated response. These involve the T cells, and I directed you to this particular video here. So I hope you went and watched it and learned something. So to summarize what is going on with the cell-mediated response, so the very first thing is some sort of antigen on the infected cell surface. So this could be a virally infected cell or a cancer cell or a pathogenic worm is recognized by a T cell. The T cell gets activated. There's other T cells that help these cells get activated, and they're called helper T cells. I don't want you to get too concerned about these helper cells. And then what happens is these cells clone themselves. Some of them become activated, and these become cytotoxic T cells, meaning they kill things by non-phagocytotic killing. So that kiss of death thing. Some of them become these memory cells. We'll talk about those memory cells right away. So here's a comparison of the humoral immune response and the cell-mediated immune response. So there's the humoral response. Remember, it involves these extracellular microbes, and it leads to the secretion of antibodies and usually leads to phagocytosis. Cellular immunity, you can see we have a larger pathogen, and it usually leads to the lysis, or the cytotoxic killing of the infected cell. There's the summary: B cells. B cells secrete antibodies, and antibodies lead to phagocytosis usually. T cells result usually in cytotoxic killing. So if you take a look at this, this is kind of a summary of that immune response. We have some sort of antigen. The antigen sometimes can be recognized or bound or held by some sort of macrophage, such as a T cell. Often there are immune regulators, such as these helper T cells, involved. This can lead to activation of B cells. Activation of T cells can actually lead to activation of both. There is a little bit of overlap between these parts of the immune system. You've got active cells that either secrete antibodies. Over here, the B cells secrete the antibodies, or direct killing, and these lead to memory cells in both cases. So here's a chart that's basically just trying to show you that different types of pathogens can activate different parts of the immune system. Some activate the humoral immunity, some activate the cell-mediated immunity. For example, first part, you can see the viruses can activate both parts of the immune system, depending on whether they're found soluble in the blood or lymph, or whether they're found infecting a cell. Some bacteria, intracellular pathogens, only affect the T cells, the cell-mediated immunity. Many other bacteria only activate the humoral part of the immune system, and so on. So let's talk about those memory cells. So what do memory cells do? They're long-lived. Long-lived can mean quite a few things. Some memory cells seem to only live a few years. Some will live 50 years or more, and they give you, hopefully, in the best case scenario, long-lived immunity to that disease. These memory cells also can be activated, and they can be activated very quickly. In many cases, the memory cells, they get activated and they act so fast you don't even know you were exposed to the pathogen. You don't get sick at all. So let's take a look at these little graphs here, talking about the primary immune response and the secondary immune response. You see the primary immune response, the exposure is right here. So there's the first exposure, and it takes, you can see there's a lag. It takes about 5 days before these antigens start to get produced in the blood in significant quantities. You can see IgM is first, followed by IgG. Like I said, they all have slightly different roles in terms of immunity, and the problem is, within 5 days, you probably have a chance to actually feel sick and to have some sort of disease and maybe infect other people. The secondary immune response. If you take a look at this, you can see that the antibodies in the blood are produced almost immediately within the first day you're actually exposed. You can see that the total amount of antibody goes through the roof. We get lots of IgM and IgG, and it's a very quick and strong response. So this is the whole idea behind immunization, which we're going to talk about here shortly, about how we want to have good memory cells and a good secondary immune response so that we don't get sick at all. So there's different types of acquired immunity that I want to talk about, and we'll talk about vaccination as a part of this package. This is called acquired immunity. First type is natural immunity. So what does that mean? It means that you got the infection. You can see this boy here got chickenpox, and hopefully will not get chickenpox ever again because his body is now making antibodies and B cells against the chickenpox, and T cells, of course. This used to be a thing, believe it or not. Before we had a chickenpox vaccine, people would throw these chickenpox parties. They would try to expose their kids to chickenpox at a young age, so you could get natural immunity. There was somebody, believe it or not, a few years ago selling candy on Facebook that apparently had been exposed to a child with chickenpox. Don't do this. We have a vaccine. It's much safer, much better than getting the actual disease. Don't do this, please. There's also natural passive immunity. We already talked about this. This is where the mother is giving antibodies to the baby, either through the placenta or through the breast milk. And then there's artificial immunity. This is really refers to vaccination. We'll talk about that shortly. You can see there's a child there getting, looks like the oral polio vaccine. So the next type of acquired immunity is called artificial passive immunity. In this case, what we're talking about is using harvested antibodies. So you can see over here on the right, this guy's getting bitten by a snake. This is actually really important in some parts of the world where we have venomous snakes. So how does this work? Basically, they will inject small amounts of the toxin into usually a large mammal that can handle it, such as a horse. And then eventually, when the horse produces an immune response, we can collect the antibodies by taking a little bit of blood. A horse doesn't usually miss a liter of blood too much, and can handle it, and we can collect those antibodies and keep them in emergency rooms. Like I said, not usually found in Fort McMurray, but in places that do have venomous snakes. So Medicine Hat has rattlesnakes, and they would have rattlesnake antivenom in their emergency room. So let's talk about vaccination, also known as immunization. So both of those words are used quite frequently. The whole idea here is we want immunity against a pathogen and we want to make memory cells, memory B cells and or T cells. And we want to do this and maybe not expose the person to the fully pathogenic pathogen, but maybe something that will be less harmful. So there are really 4 types of vaccines that are commonly used nowadays. With this new SARS virus, we're talking about this type of DNA vaccine. None of those are actually currently used, so I'm not going to address that. But I want to talk about these 4 types here. So the first type of vaccine I want to talk about are attenuated vaccines. So what is attenuated? It means kind of weak or not as virulent anyway. So the whole idea is here, there are different methods to do this, but you can take a virus or a pathogen and you can breed it in the lab and make it less virulent. There are new genetic methods to do this. There's old classical methods. This type of technique has been around for a couple hundred years since Louis Pasteur was doing it. And so the idea is that you're infecting a person with a live organism. Hopefully it's not going to cause any disease, and it will propagate and grow, and your body will have an immune response so that when you actually get the pathogenic strain or the wild type organism, you're going to have an immune response against it. Some examples of these include the polio vaccine. We're talking about the Sabin vaccine, OPV, means oral polio vaccine. The mumps, measles, rubella, varicella vaccine. This actually has 4 all in one shot. Previously it was mostly MMR. Now we have varicella in there as well, which is chickenpox. This also includes the flu mist. This is the nasal flu vaccine that's given to children. These are all live attenuated strains of these viruses. A second type are killed. So what this means is they can be killed by heat, or they can be killed by chemicals, and these vaccines, some of them are very good. Often they require booster shots because they're not growing and propagating, so the body might clear them quickly. So we also have a polio vaccine in this category. This is the IPV. This is the injectable polio vaccine, also known as the Salk vaccine, the rabies vaccine, and your typical injectable flu shot, the one that most people get every year. So a lot of newer vaccines are these things called conjugate vaccines or subunit vaccines. So usually what this means is we're taking a subunit of the pathogen. So what does that mean? Could mean a carbohydrate, could mean a protein or something like that. These can be made biologically or synthetically by chemists, and that is what's being injected into the person and not the pathogen at all. Here's some examples. We have the pneumococcal vaccine. So the pneumococcal vaccine, you can see PCV13. I believe this one includes 13 carbohydrates from Streptococcus pneumonia. There's another one here, pneumococcal 23, which has 23 carbohydrates, so that one's presumably better. The HPV vaccine, I think that's a glycoprotein found on the virus. Hepatitis B, I'm not as familiar with that one. Kind of similar to the conjugate vaccines or the toxoid vaccines, these really include parts of a toxin. So some examples of these, I've talked about these two already, the diphtheria toxin and the tetanus toxin. We don't inject the whole toxin into the individual, just half of the toxin, just the part of the toxin that doesn't actually cause any cellular damage, but enough to give a person an immune response. So here's a list of some of the vaccines that are given in Alberta. You can see there's a list of the live attenuated vaccines. So I mentioned the polio vaccine. We actually don't use this oral polio vaccine in Alberta anymore, but you can see quite a number of vaccines that people may get routinely. So the varicella vaccine, shingles vaccine, rotavirus vaccine as well. Yellow fever, you might get that if you're traveling. The inactivated vaccines include hepatitis A, rabies, anthrax, cholera, influenza, and the polio that we do get in Alberta. Not the polio we get in Alberta, the polio shot we get in Alberta. The toxoid vaccines, I mentioned the diphtheria in Texas. There's also a pertussis vaccine that is a toxoid vaccine. Conjugate vaccines, these include a lot of the newer ones, so you can see HPV, hepatitis B, Haemophilus influenza, and so on. I just want to point you to this chart. This really just shows the amazing powers of vaccines. So take a look at these numbers here. For example, diphtheria. 21,000 cases a year. This is US numbers before the vaccine was available. Since the vaccine, now we're looking at approximately 0 cases a year. So that's a 100% decrease in the disease. You can take a look at all these other diseases here, all these numbers. These are huge numbers, huge amounts of illness. I encourage you to talk to an old person about this, a grandmother or somebody who remembers these diseases, and they will tell you all about them and the miracles of vaccines. The numbers we get nowadays are much, much lower. Some diseases, smallpox for example here, has been entirely eradicated. Other diseases have been eradicated, at least in some parts of the world. Measles was eradicated in Canada in the year 2000. It's making a bit of a comeback in the last few years, unfortunately, due to people not getting vaccines. There's a few other vaccines here you can see in the bottom part of the list. These are newer vaccines introduced after 1980. The cases are going down, and those diseases we're working on, and we'll see what that looks like in the decades to come. So the whole idea behind vaccination is we're hoping to get herd immunity. What that means is that enough people are immune to a disease that it protects everybody. Because some people can't get vaccines. They may have an immune problem. They may be particularly old, so they're susceptible. You can see in this first example, we have one person who's infected and one person who's immune. This orange infected person can infect all of these gray people. So they're all at risk. You get enough people vaccinated, and we can hopefully protect these susceptible gray people. And maybe 50% of the population. We think maybe herd immunity for the influenza virus is about 40 or 50%. I'm not 100% sure what the number is for this new SARS virus, where some estimates are 40%, some estimates are 70%. Really just depends on the effectiveness of the virus or bacteria. And but if we can get enough people vaccinated, then in theory we can eradicate a disease entirely. So let's talk about a couple specific vaccines in particular. Why is there not a cold vaccine is a very good question. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of viruses that cause cold-like symptoms. We've got these rhinoviruses. Those are the usual cause, but we also have adenoviruses and several coronaviruses. That's right, coronaviruses often cause cold-like symptoms. At least 200 strains, many of them mutate from season to season, and unfortunately some of these we don't actually have very strong immune responses against, so we can actually get infected by the same virus a few years later, unfortunately. So what about the polio vaccine? It's worth talking about the polio vaccine because it's an interesting case of something that's going on in the world and something that I have actually quite a bit of interest in that I've been following for a number of years. This is the polio virus. It primarily infects the gastrointestinal tract. You can see this here, intestinal cells being infected by the polio virus, and that's where the main receptors are. Sometimes it will infect the central nervous system, and this is where sometimes people get paralyzed. This is where the disease polio can be very, very scary. If you take a look at this, this is showing what happens in most polio cases. A large percentage of people are asymptomatic, so no symptoms or either mild gastrointestinal symptoms. Sometimes people get minor symptoms, so fever, headache, sore throat, nothing really too serious. And then in a number of cases, sometimes people get infections of the central nervous system, which can lead to either non-paralytic polio or paralytic polio. But take a look at this number here. Roughly about 1% of people who get polio are getting paralyzed. That's very scary. I don't want to minimize this, and this is why we want to deal with polio, and hopefully we can eradicate it entirely. Here's what polio looks like. Again, something that none of us have ever seen in our lifetime. Actually, that's not entirely true. I believe I did see one polio victim a number of years ago when I traveled to Africa. But here's people who are paralyzed from polio. Like I said, very terrifying. So the vaccines came out in the 1950s, 60s. The first one developed was the Salk vaccine. This is the injectable or IPV, injectable polio vaccine or inactivated polio vaccine. We also developed the oral polio vaccine or the Sabine vaccine. This is the live attenuated vaccine. Here's the 1950s. You can see Elvis was lining up to get his polio vaccine. He was very excited. There were all sorts of people lining up. Parents were very, very excited. They did not want paralyzed children. Take a look at these numbers. Just plummeting. Cases per 100,000. We're going from hundreds of cases to basically 0 cases once we get to the 1980s, which is incredible to see a disease like that absolutely vanish, at least in the developed world. So take a look at this chart here. Here's another chart looking at the number of cases of polio, and you can see the polio vaccine right here, this red line, introduced 1955, and these are numbers in the United States, so plummeting from 30,000 cases a year to basically 0. 1980s, people started talking about eradicating polio. You can see 1988, the number of cases of polio was about 350,000 cases globally, and people started talking about eradicating polio and making the vaccine free and accessible to developing countries. Basically, we went from hundreds of thousands of cases a year within 20 years to only hundreds of cases in 2004, 538 cases. So in 1988, this is what the world map of polio looked like. It was all over the world. A couple of places it had been eradicated: Canada, United States, a few European countries, Australia, and a couple South American countries. 2002, this is what the polio map looked like. You can see narrowed down to actually a few parts of the world very, very rapidly. It gets a little harder to get in some of these parts of the world. Notice India there. India has like 1 billion people. It's a little bit hard to reach everybody. Different parts of Africa, again, lots of people, impoverished countries, harder to reach some of the people in the countryside. So here's a good question. What makes polio a good candidate for eradication? Turns out there's actually a few good reasons for that. Number one, polio is only found in humans. This virus only infects humans. There's no animal reservoir. It's not found in the dirt, not found in the soil, not found in some sort of wild species, only found in humans. So we don't need to worry about animals. We don't need to go and, let's say, kill all the bats or something like that. Another good reason is we have very good vaccines for it. In fact, we have 2 vaccines. That oral polio vaccine is very cheap to produce. We're talking about maybe 1 or 2 cents per dose. Very, very cheap to produce and very easy to train people to administer. We don't have to worry about syringes or training nurses. We just show people how to put drops into a child's mouth. Third reason is that the virus doesn't mutate very much. There's only actually 3 strains, and they don't really mutate like the flu virus. So here we are, 2012. You can see 3 places in the world had wild polio virus circulating, 223 cases. What are we looking at? Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan, maybe Syria. So what's going on in these places here? Well, Nigeria was just a little bit slow to get on the bandwagon with getting people vaccinated. There were rumors about the polio vaccine and rumors about HIV, and they were false. But with a slow start, they were slow to have polio eradicated. Also, Nigeria is a very populated country as well. You can see Afghanistan and Pakistan. Unfortunately, you're looking at a lot of instability and conflict in both of those regions, and they're just a little bit harder to get everyone vaccinated. So why is polio eradication proving to be difficult? Why can't we crack this? Why can't we get rid of all these cases? Again, another very good question. As I mentioned, in some of these regions, we're looking at lots of people. It's hard. Just imagine trying to vaccinate everybody in India. 1 billion people. How do you do that? You could vaccinate everybody in India today, and how many children will be born tomorrow? Thousands. It's very, very hard to reach all parts in these countries. You've got these small villages, you've got these regions that are hard to reach, but they did do it in India. It just took them a long time to do it. These other parts of the world, we're looking at conflict and things like that. The other part that makes it very, very difficult to get rid of polio once and for all is the fact that only maybe 1 in 100 cases actually show paralysis. So that means for every 1 case of polio that's detected, there could be 99 other people with the virus walking around infecting other people. So that makes it very, very difficult. So here's a little timeline. You can see I mentioned some of these numbers before. In 1988, 350,000 cases. Polio was eradicated in Canada by 1994, and type 2 polio out of 3 strains was declared eradicated worldwide in the year 1999. So good job. 2012, we eradicated type 3 polio, or at least there's a question mark there. It wasn't officially declared until I believe it was last year. 2014, India declared polio free. Good job, India. 2015, only 74 cases of wild type polio. Pakistan and Afghanistan, this was a momentous year. We were very, very close. No cases in Africa that year. 2016, 37 cases, some cases in Syria. Unfortunately, we have some instability in Syria, which has led to lax in vaccination, which means a few extra cases. 2017, 15 cases and 80 vaccine-derived cases. So vaccine-derived cases, this is another issue with polio eradication, is that unfortunately the oral polio vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine, and sometimes it will mutate and actually cause polio. We're talking about maybe 1 in a million, that's the odds. But of course, we are vaccinating millions of people, so it does happen sometimes where people will get a vaccine-derived polio. So we're hoping in many of these countries to change to the injectable inactivated polio vaccine to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Unfortunately, that takes a little bit more training and is not as cheap to administer, but that is the goal in many of these countries, to start to switch over to the injectable polio vaccine. 2018, 32 cases, unfortunately, and 2019 we did eradicate type 3 polio, and here's the numbers are going up. Unfortunately, just some parts of the world have become lax and they've stopped vaccinating, or they've slowed down their vaccination campaigns, but I do believe this is something doable, and best estimates we are able to do this within 10 years if we're very, very lucky, but people have to remain vigilant. Unfortunately, with this new pandemic going around, not everyone is going to get vaccinated, and this will probably set us behind a few years. Here's a map of 2019. You can see Pakistan and Afghanistan here are the blue. Those are the wild polio cases, and the vaccine-derived cases. A few parts in the world, mostly Africa and parts of Asia is what we're looking at. Okay, just to finish off this topic, what is our vaccine wish list? Obviously, this is number one. We're hoping to get a vaccine for this new coronavirus. This is unfortunately probably just due to all the testing and all those kind of things, take 18 months to 2 years at the soonest. So, hopefully scientists can do whatever they can do to get this done with. Number two, a universal flu vaccine. It would be lovely if we could get one flu shot, and that is the end of it, not annual flu shots. Turns out we can do this in llamas. I don't know why. Somebody probably knows the answer to this. Why can't we do it in humans? We would love to have an MRSA vaccine. Why not? People are working on it. Major scourges of the developing world, HIV. This is the only way we're ever going to end HIV, is if we can get an effective vaccine. So more on HIV in the next unit. Malaria and tuberculosis, these are things that are affecting many people worldwide. If we could have effective vaccines, it would change the lives of many, many people. There are all sorts of parasite and fungal vaccines that are lacking and are affecting people in the developing world. And if we can get these vaccines produced, then we can actually probably save a lot of lives and affect the quality of life of people worldwide. What about the future of vaccines? Here's some other interesting things. Alzheimer's vaccine, people are working on things like this. Acne vaccines, cancer vaccines. You may have heard of many of these different types of things. I'm not going to elaborate on them too much because this video is already getting a little bit long. Vaccines to treat addictions, group B strep, these are things I've read about in some of the scientific literature. Okay, so that concludes Topic 13, Part 2, Adaptive Immunity. Please download the PowerPoint and notes and take a look at them, and email me if you have any questions. Here are some of the terms that you should learn and some of the reading references, and you can check out that resource link at the bottom of the page. Don't forget to take a look at these study questions and email me or contact me if you have any further questions. I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy.